2025 is just getting started, and already Zelos is blowing my mind with one of the coolest skeleton watches that I've ever seen. From the moment I got this watch in, I haven't stopped shooting macro footage of it because it's just so much fun to film. Some people might think it's easy to make a skeletonized watch, but it's actually very difficult to make a good one. Did Zelos manage to pull all of that off? Well, take a quick look and then we'll get into it. Hey guys, this is Dave. Welcome back to Just a Watch, a channel all about affordable watches. As always, I'm recording this from my home in Iwate, Japan, and today we're going to be looking at a watch from Singapore, which is kind of in this area of the world. That brand is Zelos, or Zelos, as a lot of you guys like to say. And they are one of the most popular and highly respected micro brands around. Also, they have the somewhat unfortunate reputation of being difficult to acquire because everything they do is in limited runs. The release of this watch will be coming up soon. And in this video, I'll try to give you all the information you need to decide whether or not this is a watch you're going to want to purchase, because you're probably only going to have a very short window to do it. Also, keep in mind that this watch was given to me by Zelos for free, which is why you saw the paid promotions flag in the beginning of this video. However, Zelos did not have any control over the content of this review. Let's jump in and take a look at the new 40mm version of the Zelos Skyraider. This new Zelos Skyraider 40mm is a curious mix of an ultra-modern body with a vintage heart. And what I mean by that is that the exterior of the watch, as well as the bracelet, the clasp, the crystal, the dial, the hands, all of these feature the latest advances in watchmaking, including a titanium construction, a bracelet that can be easily interchanged thanks to quick-release spring bars and easily resized on the fly with tool-free micro-adjust on the clasp, as well as an advanced titanium construction, with Zelos' clean, hyper-modern design language shaping the entire look of the watch. By contrast, the movement that lies at the heart of this watch is a vintage 1960s Marvin 700. This is a movement that is over 60 years old that has been resurrected from a bygone era, which has been completely refurbished and transformed with this skeletonized treatment. Visually, the result is stunning. This is a beautiful and extremely cool skeletonized watch. And yet it still strikes me as somewhat odd having such an advanced and futuristic looking watch powered by such an ancient movement. And the age of that movement does lead me to ask some uncomfortable questions that we'll get into in a little bit. But first, let's get into the dimensions and specifications of this watch, because this is the third version of the Skyraider from Zelos, and this new 40mm size not only had a strong influence on the design of the watch, but also in the choice of the movement. This time around, the case diameter is dropped down to 40mm. You get 20mm lugs with a 47mm wingspan measuring from lug to lug. Perhaps the most impressive dimension is the thickness. The watch is very slim, with the actual case of the watch being roughly 8mm thick and capped by a beautiful boxed sapphire crystal that rises nearly 2mm above that for a total thickness that still comes in just barely under 10mm. Traditionally, pilot's watches are made much larger than this, but this is anything but a traditional pilot's watch. I really like these dimensions. Visually, I like the proportions on my 7.5-inch wrist. To my eye, it does not appear undersized. And these modest dimensions, combined with the incredible slimness and the lightweight titanium construction, make it incredibly comfortable to wear. Ultimately, though, watch size is a very personal thing, and in that regards, I think it's a good thing that Zelos is offering it now at this 40mm size. Hopefully, people who preferred a larger watch purchased the previous versions, while those who are waiting for a more svelte timepiece will have the option to get this one. And it is this vintage Marvin 700 movement that allows for these dimensions to become possible on this watch. Previous versions of the Skyraider came in at 42mm and featured a modern ETA-based movement. However, when Zelos decided to drop down to 40mm for this newest edition of the Skyraider, they discovered that that ETA movement would no longer fit into a 40mm case, forcing them to have to search around for an alternative. And the decision to make this a skeletonized watch further limited their choices. Creating a skeletonized movement is both an artistic and technical endeavor, the goal of which is to expose the inner workings of the movement so that they can be appreciated. while balancing the need to ensure that the movement is stable and supported, as well as being aesthetically pleasing to look at. The Marvin 700 movement fit the bill for what Zelos was looking for, in that it was a small enough movement to fit into the dimensions they were going for, and that it had a beautiful architecture that, once exposed by the skeletonization process, would offer an appealing view into the workings of this watch to the user. Prior to the skeletonization process, the Marvin 700 looks fairly simple, and Zelos was able to get a batch of new old stock movements and send them over to a watchmaker in Switzerland for a full refurbishment, as well as this skeletonization process. They decided to go with a very extensive skeletonization process that exposes all of the parts of the movement, going so far as to cut out the front of the ratchet wheel, allowing a clear view into the mainspring, which now actually serves as a sort of power reserve indicator. When the watch is fully wound, you can see that that spring is coiled very tightly, but it loosens up as the watch unwinds, giving you a visual reminder that you need to wind your watch. After skeletonizing the bridges, Zelos also applied a rhodium treatment to give it a striking appearance that contrasts with the gold and silver tones of the balance and wheels. The end result is a gorgeous movement that is almost completely see-through, with all of the main components of a watch movement completely visible. All of this contributes to making this an incredibly unique movement that does enhance the collectability of this watch significantly. When you start getting into watch collecting, one aspect of the hobby does really center around the types of movements that you can get in your watches. In-house movements become very desirable, but this is something that micro brands have a very difficult time doing. It's very expensive to produce your own movement in-house. And so I really appreciate what Zelos has done here by going with this historic movement and then completely transforming it with this modern skeletonization process to create something very unique and to give watch collectors something very special. But a movement like this does also introduce some questions that I have. The biggest concern would be related to the performance of the movement, given that this is a vintage movement from the 1960s. Thankfully, Zelos did go through an extensive refurbishment process, so the movement is performing very well. It has been very accurate for me on my wrist, but the architecture is still over 60 years old. One thing that you'll notice very quickly is that this watch does not feature hacking. So when you pull the crown out, the second hand will continue to tick. Not only does this make it a little bit difficult to set the time precisely, it also means that you have another traditional aviation watch feature that is being omitted here, as a hacking second hand was considered essential to military aviation watches. There's not a lot of information about this movement on the internet. One site that I found said that the movement features a 2.5 hertz beat rate, but when looking at my watch, it appears to have a 3 hertz beat rate that ticks 6 times per second. You should also be getting a 46-hour power reserve on this manually wound movement, but overall, this is not a high performance or highly accurate movement. This is a vintage and beautiful movement. And to me, this is an odd juxtaposition because pilots' watches so often are now about the most modern and advanced features in watchmaking. And this version of the Zelos Skyraider is really a combination of both old and new, with, again, a very ancient movement and a very modern exterior. This is something that might put some people off, but others might find very appealing. For me, the experience of wearing this watch and seeing it and watching it work really outweighs my typical preference for watches following tradition. One odd thing about this movement is that the hour hand does seem to wobble a bit. This is something that's so subtle you probably would never notice it looking at the watch in real time, but definitely if you look at a time lapse or where you speed the footage up, you can see that the hour hand is kind of moving forward and backward a little bit as it goes around the dial. And I have no idea if this is a quirk of the Marvin 700 movement or if it's an issue with the particular movement that I have. And that's another consequence of going with a vintage movement like this. Fortunately, it doesn't seem to affect the timekeeping at all. Mine is still keeping very accurate time. And again, I only noticed this because I shot some time-lapse footage of the watch. But one final concern that you might have with a movement like this is your ability to get the watch serviced. It would already be a challenge for watchmakers to find parts for a 60-year-old movement like this, but this movement has also undergone an extensive skeletonization process, which means that you're probably going to have to rely on Zelos to do any of the service work that might be necessary down the road. Thankfully, Zelos has thought of this, and they have extra movements on hand to be able to handle any of these servicing needs for these watches in the future. Zelos does this with all of their watches. They said even their very first watch that they launched, they still have parts and movements ready for any replacements or repairs. And that initial launch was about 10 years ago. So as long as Zelos is in business, you should be able to get this watch serviced. Now, Zelos is still a relatively young company in terms of watch years, but as far as micro brands go, they have one of the best reputations in terms of customer service and satisfaction, which should give you some additional peace of mind when it comes to considering the purchase of this watch. Next, let's move on to the design, and I want to pay particular attention to the legibility of this watch because this is one of the things that skeletonized watches tend to struggle with the most, and yet I think Zelos has done an excellent job in this regard on this watch. When I saw the initial product shots, I assumed this watch was going to be fairly difficult to read, which is very common with skeletonized watches. And that's one of the reasons I chose the Supernova colorway. This version features orange tone loom on the hands and on the hour markers. And that color is actually surprisingly legible. It's very easy to pick out the hands and the markers on this watch, to the point that I never had any problem reading it. And that shocked me because skeletonized watches are usually very difficult to read with so much going on. Personally, I think Zelos should have gone with a matte silver tone color to the handset rather than a black handset. Other than the orange loom paint, the hands are almost completely invisible. The black outlines of the handset are perfectly camouflaged against the skeletonized dial and skeletonized bridges of the movement, almost giving the illusion that the orange parts of the hands are just hovering around the dial. Which is cool, but I think that a matte silver handset would have increased the legibility even more and matched the color of the titanium case. While the choice of going with an orange tone loom paint on the hands and markers is going to increase the legibility during the day, anytime you start to add color to the loom, it always degrades the performance of the loom after dark. It's just not going to glow as brightly as straight BGW9 or C3. So don't expect to get a dive watch level of performance out of this. But that said, the loom is still pretty good. The orange tinted loom takes on a yellowish glow after dark, and the second and minute indexes glow a cool blue color in the dark. This gives you a very cool multicolored glow, while also giving you a sufficient level of brightness to read the watch in the dark, at least for a little while. The case design and finishing are both somewhat simple. You do get some sharp, aggressive lugs, and I think it was a good choice to show some restraint here because the face of the watch is really what's going to be driving the attention and interest of this piece. However, the bracelet is very interesting. This is a custom bracelet that has a sort of tongue and groove design. I think it really matches the character of this watch and really sets it apart from other lower priced options. This is a premium watch, and going with a custom bracelet like this that doesn't look like anything else on the market is a nice advantage. That said, the bracelet does have a few quirks to it. Most noticeably, the links are very tightly integrated with one another, and so the bracelet doesn't really have a lot of articulation. It flexes a little bit, but it has a much more rigid structure to it that will generally stay in a circular shape without collapsing. So it definitely has a different feel on the wrist than a bracelet that has more articulation that might be able to lay flat, but I still found it quite comfortable. One advantage that this bracelet design has is that the links are very small, which means that it's very easy to get a good fit on this bracelet. You can really customize it to the size of your wrist. And this is further enhanced by the clasp, which has an excellent tool-free micro-adjust system, meaning that you should always be able to get a perfect fit here. But there was one aspect of this bracelet that was pretty annoying, and that's that it does occasionally snag the hairs on my wrist, particularly on the underside of my wrist. It's not nearly as bad as what you find on cheap folded link bracelets, but generally it's the kind of thing you would hope to avoid on a higher end watch like this. And I think probably the reason for this is that design of the links where they're so tightly connected to one another. But for me personally, the benefits of the bracelet outweighed that one negative. Another nice feature is that this bracelet includes quick release spring bars, which means that it's very easy to swap this over to a strap if you should so choose. And thanks to the 20mm lug width, you're going to get a lot of options when it comes to strap changing. And I think the style of this watch is really fun to play around with different straps. Again, it has both elements of a very industrial, modern tool watch, and yet at the same time, a very retro and vintage look with the skeletonized dial and all of the gears and moving parts that you see inside of it. And you can amplify either of those personalities with the strap that you choose to put on it. The bracelet definitely leans more into that industrial, technical look. And I think going with a sailcloth style strap sort of preserves that aspect of the watch. Whereas if you put it on a tasteful brown leather strap, it starts to bring out the more vintage charm that you have. Finally, let's wrap this up by talking about value. Depending on the case material that you choose, the price is going to range anywhere from $1,749 up to $2,499. This titanium version that we're looking at is the lower priced option. Even on the bracelet, you're going to be able to get that for the $1,749 launch price, which makes this one of Zelos's top of the line watches. Zelos does a lot of affordable watches that are under $500 at launch. The Skyraider is a platform for them to show off what they can do at this higher price range. It's what allows them to give you this incredibly unique movement, the awesome skeletonization work that's been done to it, and create a watch that competes with luxury watches in terms of quality and style, while doing so in a price range that is considerably lower than what you would typically find from similar watches from more established brands. These watches will be launching on Zelos' website very soon, and they are likely to sell out fairly quickly. So as always, if you want to get your hands on one of these watches from Zelos, your best bet is to be on their website when the sale goes live. And they have a big countdown clock letting you know down to the second when they will go live so you can be ready. All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for today. Drop me a comment down below and let me know what you think of this watch. And if you have any relevant experience with the Zelos brand or the Skyraider series, let me know what you think as well. Always love to hear from you guys. There's a link to Zelos' website down below so you can get ready for the release of this if you're interested in picking it up. There's also a link to my website at justthewatch.com if you want to pick up a cool t-shirt like this one. That will wrap it up for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you later. Bye.